Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello, everyone. This is Perry Clark back with you, licensed marriage and family therapist, and welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I want to remind everyone that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes and does not constitute working with a licensed mental health professional. Please seek one out in your area to work on your unique issues. And if they're not in your area, at least look at also the video stuff so someone in your state can help you. So today's episode, I'm continuing with some of the, in a vein of some of my other guests, whether you've heard when we talk with like Alexis Overstreet or Steve Sawyer or Regina, with Tracy Cantmaroy, we're talking with somebody who blends the worlds of our POC and BIPOC POC identities with Brainspotting in their connective work. So today's guest is Regina Faridnia. Now, I'll let them fix it, but you know how I sadly screw up names on here, even though I try not to. Regina is a licensed clinical social worker and owner of Indigenous Counseling and Wellness Center. She is a member of the United Homa National, which is of Louisiana. She participates in local tribal activities in California, where she resides currently. Regina is a resource around Middle Eastern culture. Her spouse is Persian. She also works with first and second responders, addiction, over 20 years worth of experience, complex and developmental trauma, historical and intergenerational trauma, as well as adoption, all members of the triad. She has been part of the POC coalition within a county organization and planning BIPOC cultural events. She has presented nationally regarding the overlaps and parallels between Native American traditions and Brainspotting. Regina is a Brainspotting trainer and consultant, EMDR trained, Mindfulness and mind-body medicine trained, and is a Somatic Experiencing Practioner, SEP. She utilizes a strength-based and culturally sensitive and formed person-centered approach. She's been in private practice since 2010 and is currently completing a PhD in natural and integrative medicine. Regina, welcome to Untying Knots, and I apologize for screwing up the last name.
Oh, good morning, Perry. My last name is Faridnia, and as you mentioned, I have Indigenous Counseling and Wellness, and which I started in 2010, but I've been in the field since about 1995, which kind of dates me.
So you've also been able to see some of the changes in what we are actually doing and how we're doing mental health compared to what they have been, that probably most people have built their ideas around what mental health is. So to that end, how did you find yourself in all of this? How did you get here?
So I started out in the field working at the Veterans Hospital and during grad school, trying out different things in the field, working with domestic violence, working with addictions treatment. And then after that, when I moved to California, I was working for Child Protective Services. I did that for 10 years. During that work, I noticed that there were a lot of youth that I worked with that I would refer out for therapy. And as you mentioned about the field changing, I had become aware of the approaches that were somatic, particularly at that time, EMDR. And I was referring youth out for EMDR treatment, but then I checked back with their therapist 4 to 6 months later and to ask how the EMDR is going. And the therapist would say, "Oh, we're just doing talk." And even though this was an EMDR therapist. And so I was a little disillusioned. And plus the kids were getting so much turnover of therapists. I felt like my heart was leading me to want to do more clinical work.
Mm-hmm.
And plus the toll of being a CPS worker, I looked around me, there was so much dark humor and flat affect. I didn't want to become that. So I did a lot of mindfulness in order to take care of myself. Studied with the Center for Mind Body Medicine. I was
Mm-hmm.
using massage to actually physically feel in my body, because it was a type of work that was where I saw the worst of the worst on a regular basis,
Mm-hmm.
and had to go into court and testify about those situations that were, some of the most difficult situations that one might see. So I came to like this crossroads in my life, and really felt my heart pulling towards wanting to do work clinically so that I could really address the trauma directly and
Mm-hmm.
over time, and really be alongside someone. And
Mm-hmm.
because from what I was understanding, there was so much more to the somatic approaches than what I had learned in talk therapy,
Mm-hmm.
having come through college in the mid 90s. And so I wanted to explore that more, and I began to move in the direction. I started my practice at that point. And then I trained in EMDR and found that somewhat helpful. And then I heard about this thing called Brainspotting, and
Mm-hmm.
someone had given me their card, and I just looked it up online, and I signed up, not really even fully knowing what it was at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And I was blown away when I was in my phase 1 training, just at the depth of what it could get to, the pre-verbal trauma, the pieces that I had never personally been able to touch in
Mm-hmm.
any other approach that I had tried. And so I knew that this was something really powerful to be able to bring to help others to heal their traumas in a profound way.
Fair enough, very much so. And I think you hit on a number of things that I definitely will think we would probably want to circle back and discuss from what you experienced there. But just the standpoint of the nature of this preverbal trauma, which is also part of the developmental trauma, is something that, I don't know, it's an interesting thing that no one, I don't think really people think about the fact that we can be exposed to trauma from the moment we enter the world, or even before we enter the world itself.
Mm-hmm.
To think that it's all something that happens once you become an adult or become a teenager there's a disconnect there with the idea of trauma.
Yeah, trauma is definitely not just what we remember. It's
Mm-hmm.
our body remembers before we have
Mm-hmm.
this concept of our, images. So we start getting images, I think, between like around age 4 is when we
Mm-hmm.
typically have image memories. I mean, there are cases or times where someone might remember something younger, but typically before that, for most of a youth's experience before the age of 4 is not going to be consciously remembered.
But it will be remembered in the body.
Exactly.
Which now makes me wonder, is that even talked about in any of these child development classes with parents?
No.
Assuming they even take a child development class.
No, but I do feel like in the adoption world that there is more awareness of that, because adoptive parents have been struggling for a long time to figure out that piece, because just having a child move into even the best, most loving home doesn't take away that there was a trauma that happened, a breach in the child's experience that's related to attachment that can bubble up in so many different ways as the youth is growing up, and because it's something that the youth can't remember, if you just treat the behaviors that come up as the young person begins to act out, you're not getting to the root of what's driving that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are ways within this process that we can find out what the roots are, or get a sense of that. And it might be even just an empty hole, and a common one is that empty hole in the gut area.
Mm-hmm.
And what's profound about that is that can also be kind of what predisposes someone to addiction, right? That sense of trying to fill something. When I was at the Veterans Hospital in Seattle, I was placed in the Addictions Treatment Center, and I noticed that we had a disproportionate amount of adoptees, former foster youth, and individuals who were raised by family. And so I did my research on that and found that 33% of the individuals in our Addictions Treatment Center who filled out the questionnaire had actually either been adopted, raised in foster care, or raised by relatives. And when you think about in our world, only 1% of individuals are adopted. Maybe 1% have been in foster care. That's pretty disproportionate.
Yeah. Very much so. I also wonder if there's an element too, even with our growing issues around depression as well, that fits in this too. That especially when we're seeing depression in young kids.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes you have a child who has symptoms of depression and no one knows why. And, there certainly can be the biochemical where it's passed down within the family, but there are also instances. For an example, I had one youth that came to me, had depression, had a grandma in the home and two parents that were incredibly supportive. Both parents were well trained within our mental health field. No one had any idea of prior trauma for this youth. Even herself, she couldn't name any prior trauma, but all she could tell me was there was this black hole, was what she was sensing. And so I said, draw it. And she drew it in the middle of a medicine shield. This young woman was indigenous, and that became her brain spot. I literally held up that picture that she drew, and we were able to find a place where she felt it. So we don't have to know where that black hole that represents depression came from. There may be no images that a person may remember, but there's a place in their body that they feel it, and we can contact that through finding the eye position. And so even if that memory is pre-verbal, it's going to be able to process without having to figure out, when an incident happened, or for she had no words for it to even describe it. So, and Brainspotting is amazing in our ability to be able to work with those things.
Very much so. And I think you've also hit on a natural, nice little segue into some more of what we want to talk about, is that aspect of working with the Native American population, in addition to how Brainspotting is also connected to this. And as I read in your bio, how there is a sort of a natural relationship between them. So which one of those do you want to start with?
Yeah. So when I came into Brainspotting, I noticed that there was a number of just really natural parallels with, with our indigenous kind of values and our ways of being in the world. And so, I became curious about that. And I also, began to kind of bring those thoughts together because I wanted to think about it as for me, a primary thing has always been, is this something that's going to be helpful for my community? So when I say my community, I'm originally from Louisiana. My tribe is United Home and Nation, but at this point in my life, I'm living in California. And so while I still have attachment to that original community, most of my participation is with the Bay Area Native community and Sacramento region. because these are places that I've lived for the last 20 years. But how is it going to be helpful for my community? When I was working for the county, a lot of my work was, bridging social services and our Native community, and helping social services to be able to have a better connection with the community, because, there's a lot that's broken there. And then now, as I moved into private practice, it's always at the forefront of my mind. If in what I'm doing, is that there a way that this is going to be helpful for our communities? And it really struck me that this modality in particular, out of all the modalities I've been trained in, had a lot to offer as far as being more decolonizing, and in the way that it's set up. As far as that it's not protocol driven, that we follow the person's nervous system versus trying to lead it, that we're sitting with the person mindfully and trusting that the process is going to go wherever it needs to go. I mean, these are all things with our Indigenous community that are a part of what are honored. And so I saw that all of that in the Brainspotting work that I was doing. And Brainspotting was, I would say, a bit cutting edge in that we began to have a BIPOC branch before a lot of other psychotherapy modalities. And I became active in developing that, and as an assistant, and we call our assistants facilitators, because we're actually quite actively involved in the training process, and then became a consultant through that track. And I was noticing that we didn't have a lot of other Native clinicians, and I'm like, I was holding the two things, like, it's like, this is so resonant, but why aren't a lot of my Native community showing up? And what I felt was that because of the level of fear due to historical trauma, it's just a whole nother layer of being hard to trust psychotherapies, for one, and then also even to feel safe within BIPOC community, that our Native community needed to be able to come together as a community, to do this together with the incorporation of our traditions within the process, for it to feel safe enough. And it's been, I think it has been a lot of what's the word, a lot to overcome, even to get there together as a community. There's so many, the financial barriers as well is huge, more than a lot of other even BIPOC communities. Most of our helpers are working in Native agencies and with nonprofit pay. So they're not typically my colleagues that are Indigenous are not typically working in private practice. They're not typically working in the higher paying parts of the field, the hospital systems, or agencies that pay more. They're more working on within Indian health. And so that makes it another barrier, as far as being able to sit at the table of with other clinicians and having access. And then the higher level of mistrust of something that's new. Our spirituality was, illegal for a large period of time, a recent period of time in this country's history. And so, that that's a piece that's really primary in that it's something that's very close for our Indigenous clinicians. It's something that in the work that they do, it's just part of it, and so it's like they don't want to. My sense, anyway, in working with my peers, and is that of not wanting to leave that part behind, right? So that what's more interesting is approaches that do allow for that aspect to be able to come in to the work, and to be able to be with other Native clinicians, and for the approach to feel as though it's responsive to the community values, and those pieces are layered in and part of the approach, and the way that individuals are I will just say the experience.
Oh, so much. And you said so many very interesting points there. I mean, one of those being the aspect of decolonizing, which is a concept that for many I would think that many would not even think about, that there needs to be decolonizing in mental health is one thing. And just for those who wondering what is decolonization, it is the aspect of not focusing this from a Western, white, dominated, Eurocentric idea of what needs to be done, which is counter to Native American, counter to Asian, counter to Middle Eastern, counter to Latin American, counter to African American principles and cosmologies of how we've built the world around us. And come to think of it, as you pointed out, is that during 2020 and everything that happened with George Floyd's murder, that's when I did start seeing things like IFS and a number of the other emotional focused therapy, all now coming out with big programs for BIPOC people at that time. But where were you before that?
Yeah, for sure. And definitely some more, I think, higher level of challenges implementing it, because I'm trained in multiple modalities. So I kind of had experience of different modalities and the way they've tried to do it. And there's definitely been a lot of challenges with some of the modalities. But I would say that within Brainspotting, we had 100% support from the top all the way, through the organization, as far as at least from David Grand supporting and working very hand in hand with the BIPOC community as we were developing that branch, which was really powerful.
Could you speak a little more to that experience of working with David, and and also to more about Brainspotting for those who have just now hearing about it, what this is and what that's been all like?
Yes, so I didn't get to meet David directly until I was presenting at the international conference in Denver about how Brainspotting parallels our Native traditions. At that point, I was in the process of becoming a consultant, and so he wanted to meet me. But also, as I was helping with trainings before that, I was also aware, even before I met David, that he had a lot of support for our community, and that things were, just the beauty of the BIPOC trainings was just amazing, and that within the trainings, I having had trainings that were non-BIPOC before the branch developed, because I had been in Brainspotting for a couple of years at that point, that we were able to do it in a way that felt resonant, and to do it to offer it in ways that the connection with community was able to be placed in a primary way. And just each and every training was just such a beautiful and I would say spiritual experience. And so it was an amazing opportunity when I got to meet David at the international conference and get to talk with him briefly, but also very intimidating for me, being a naturally introverted person.
Oh, I get you. I'm a hard introvert as well, but this job and this podcast is like, okay, so it moves me towards the middle point, but it's like, no, I very much get you. It's like, I don't want to be seen by people at a certain point of the day. Just let me be.
But what was refreshing is that my experience of him was like, well, what do you feel like you need for your community? What does your community need, and how can we provide that support? And so that, just felt like within the process of the BIPOC branch of Brainspotting forming, he was 100% there. And then with this idea of creating a space for our Native clinicians to try to bring them more into the fold, he was behind that as well. That it was just, he was open to what the community said it needed, which is, research. That's what research says, is particularly with our Native community, is that the approach should be to ask the community, not to impose on the community what we think, or what, a dominant group might think the community needs, right? And so he
and that's an example of decolonizing.
Exactly. Yeah. So he was right there with, how can we support, what does the community need, and let's make it happen. And then he paired me up with to work with Steve Sawyer, because Steve Sawyer is a Native clinician, and so I reached out to Steve, and I had already been working with another trainer who had been doing some training on the Fond du Lac reservation, Deb Antonori. So I was doing those two things simultaneously, as working with Deb, as Steve and I were kind of figuring out what this was going to look like, and deciding to do the first Indigenous phase 1. And being that it was in the middle of COVID, I believe the first one was done virtually. So and first several were virtual.
And if anything, the virtual has been one of the biggest things that's allowed much more of the BIPOC nation to grow with our clinicians, because I think we actually met briefly during the 2019 when we did in person in Atlanta. If I remember correctly, we were there.
I wasn't in Atlanta.
Oh, okay. But okay, so I've seen you at some of the other, I think I started seeing you more at the online ones as we went forward from there. But that's one of those things where even the technology and time has been able to allow us this fostered growth.
Yeah, so one of the things that doing it virtually allowed us to do was to bring in some First Nations community from Canada. We had a participant from Ecuador. And so we tried to really open that up to, to include all of the Americas, and also Pacific Islanders who might be interested. So we try to, just cast the net and let the communities know that this is what we have, and see who might be interested, get the word out to many different communities. And this last training we had it locally here near Sacramento, and we had individuals who came from Washington State and Minnesota to participate in the training. So it's definitely the word has spread, pretty far, and which has been a beautiful thing.
Very much so. And I think that's a beautiful place for us to take a break. So we're going to go and pause here and come out back for our second half, folks. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, and we're here with Regina Faridnia.
Faridnia.
Faridnia. Okay, it's that I'm screwing up on here. Faridnia is here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be back shortly.
Follow Voice America at facebook.com/Voice America for juicy updates from your favorite radio shows and podcasts.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Men are currently in a mental health crisis. Suicide, addiction, and loneliness are on the rise. Men need mentorship, community, and guidance. On the Men's Therapy Podcast with Mark Azulay, you'll hear from experts on topics that men care about the most: financial health, relationships, fitness, emotional management, and lifestyle design. Listen live every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time and 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.
Find out what makes the most successful people tick. Keep listening to the Voice America Empowerment Channel. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Welcome back, folks, to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Regina Faridnia. Faridnia. Just the joys of my dyslexia. Faridnia, here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. And so we were just talking the first half about Regina's work with Native community, working with Brainspotting and so forth. And we've also mentioned fellow trainer Steve Sawyer. And so I'm actually going to be taking Steve's training, which is on developmental trauma that he started this year. I'm taking it in October when it comes to Sacramento. I could have gone to LA, but Sacramento worked better for my schedule. And I also understand you have a training as well that is starting up, which I know I'm going to be attending next month. So for those of you listening, this is for when the next time this training comes up, because we're probably going to be hearing this in October. You want to keep your eyes out for this training. So tell us a bit about your training that's coming up.
Yeah, so I feel like it's a little bit different take. It's I don't know that there's ever been a historical trauma training that's quite like the way that I approach it, because yeah, of course there are some things that are typical where we may talk about the history of what's happened with different communities. That's going to be always incorporated, but the pieces that I feel like I bring to this are there are certain ways that I listen when I'm working with someone, things that we can pick up on that are super subtle that can help us to find a way to work with someone who has historical trauma. I'm sure just about any community could have some history of historical trauma, but some communities have it disproportionately. Mm-hmm. So historical trauma disproportionately impacts our BIPOC communities. And how do we tap into that? How does it show up in our office? So there are some things that I feel like often will go unnoticed by a therapist that could be very key in tapping into something that is very crucial, a very crucial connection for that person to the historical trauma in their lineage. And so those are some of the pieces that I'm going to try to impart in my training, like how do I do that? Because it's been incredibly deep and phenomenally shifting for individuals to be able to tap into those aspects, those pieces. Some individuals may come in and already have some ideas about their historical trauma from what they know, but there are individuals who don't know anything about it, but yet feel as though it impacts them. That's one community. For example, I had someone who came in who had ancestors who were in the Holocaust and wanted to figure out how to tap into that. They had never talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
This individual knew that they were feeling a lot of anxiety related to current political climate.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, I think it's related to my parents having been in the Holocaust, but I don't know how to tap into it. So, I asked them, is there an image from a movie or from something you've ever read about the Holocaust that just really stood out to you? And this individual was able to come up with something, and that's where we started from. And it was something that really, where they could feel it on a gut level within their body. So, that would be the kind of example. Also, I would say sometimes the person may not even consciously have a link, but there's something that my knowledge of their community's history of historical trauma and what there is showing up in the office, that there might be a link. And in a brain spotting way, if I notice something like that, I'm going to offer it without, feeling, without looking for the word, investment. Like I'm not leading their process, but if there's something like that shows up, I may mention it to the person and ask them, I'll just say, if this resonates, then notice. If not, don't worry about it, and there are those pieces that sometimes, for example, maybe someone whose family has a history of slavery, and at this point they have an ankle bracelet because of something that happened in their life, right? And they're experiencing a ton of shame. They don't want the neighbors to see them. And it feels like that there's a really higher than typical level of shame with this individual, like helping that connection to happen, right? And healing those layers of historical shame, that this person is carrying beyond just what they're experiencing today in this lifetime. But what are the ripples with their ancestor, and what needs to process within their body related to that experience that's beyond just right now.
And I think there's that standpoint too, where we get back into, as I was saying earlier, the Western dominated standpoint of recognizing where ancestral energy is connected to us here and now as well. And the idea that, no, these are separate people that you don't have to hold some sort of connection or responsibility to or influence from.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways that we can connect to ancestors. And one of them, that's people typically think of is asking the ancestor to come forward and support us. But, in a way of spirituality, or having an awareness that the ancestors are there for us. But there's also tapping into these ancestral experiences of trauma that the body may still be holding.
Which you're not going to hear a conversation like that happen on too many of our fellow practitioners, podcasts, and so forth, because I'm going to openly admit I'm a transpersonal therapist as well. So I definitely look at the aspect of where spirit or the ancestors are in this process that might be forgotten by others or ignored by others, because it is part of our history.
Yeah. And I think that many communities are closer to that right? But in current day, and many have lost that connection with that aspect, right? And it's an important thing. I think the reclaiming of it, the reconnecting allows for that gap, that healing that potentially is there to be able to unfold. Like one of the things that we don't recognize enough is that so I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought for a second.
That's all right.
We don't recognize enough that our ancestors, our communities before us knew how to heal phenomenally. Sometimes you were asking, I know you were planning to ask me about like the therapy myth versus reality. And I think this would be a point of that.
Let's jump to it.
It's the myth is that we have these psychotherapy tools that are evidence-based, and this is the way that people heal today. And I think the reality is that there are very good psychotherapies that are coming up that are not yet evidence-based, they're practice-based. And in practice, what we're seeing is the results are holding, and there are evident, there are peer-reviewed articles that are written on some of these modalities. They've been in peer-reviewed journals. They just haven't hit that benchmark of being evidence-based at this point. And what defines evidence-based? I mean, now evidence-based is also somewhat Calvinistic model. And so practice-based is equally important to consider. And that kind of goes to a concept from our indigenous community called two-eyed seeing, bringing the best of both, right? So you bring in that scientific viewpoint that maybe comes, from the Western side, and there's some things to contribute, but also bringing in that indigenous viewpoint is equally important. And so what our ancestors knew and the ways that healing happened were incredibly phenomenal. And I think probably even to this day, one of the things that strongly influences me is I've got an almost 80-year-old mom who had polio. And during the time that she had polio, she was treated by her grandmother in a traditional way. And she was maybe 6 years old and has the memories of leaves that her grandmother put across her legs, and that she remembers her speaking in traditional language and praying over her and treating her with this natural medicine. And my mom has healed from that and has had a normal life, where a lot of people who had polio never walked again.
Well, let alone the aspect of living in the iron lung, for lack of a better description, too.
Exactly.
It's like there's a whole conceptual lack of memory, if you will. And we saw that, too, come up with everything that happened with COVID as well, the sense that this is something new, but we've been dealing with disease as long as we've been on this world.
Yeah. And so there's deep in wisdom, is that we can pull from, and that there are things that I think are coming more to the forefront today that have been known for a long time. So it's like gaps are getting filled in, perhaps, between what was known and today. And I think that these are really important things to be happening. I think it's part of reclaiming cultural lineages. When you think particularly of African American populations and Native American populations, a lot of that was purposely taken away, and there's the refinding it again, and those were things that were maybe feared because they weren't understood, but they were things that were very helpful to be able to tap into one's body and to understand what makes a system whole, and what is the spiritual connection. Because when we lose that, that's where we struggle and we flounder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm just letting that sink in for a bit. And the aspect of one of the most key things is when we hear somebody's being treatment resistant under the evidence base. Well, that's just the example. It's the wrong. They're standing in that void and gap where, some of these other practice-based or even original cultural-based practices would be more useful. And especially in that aspect of where does it give agency? Where does it give autonomy? Because if anything, as you said, those that were practices were misunderstood is one way to look at this. There's also those who wanted to have power and autonomy over people. So what's the way to do that is to remove the things that give them strength, identity, to be able to make them subservient.
For sure. And that just reminds me of some of the other pieces with the echoes and ripple training too. It's like, what are all those impacts that happen from the things that were and stripped away, or from the experiences, right? And what does that feel like in someone's body? So if we know that someone who has certain historical experience is more likely to feel trapped in their body, to feel like they need to run, right? For example, how do we attend to that, right? If you don't think in a historical context, then those things don't make sense. But if you consider a historical context, right? Two things. If you consider trusting a person's nervous system, that it's telling you something when they're feeling something inside, that's one piece. But the other piece is, okay, and I know they're noticing that. Is there potentially a historical context that might be connected to? So that's a piece that can be really important to establish, and it's a different way of looking at things than we typically do. Like what you're mentioning of the way of that's more problem focused, right? Versus being it's not even solution focused. It's like being present, being really attuned with that individual, and being open to the story that their nervous system is going to tell. Feels completely different than the judgment that sometimes happens, when helpers get burnt out because maybe there's problems that they can't solve and they keep seeing them over and over again. So then it gets a label over here. Yeah.
Which is also another beautiful segue, circling back to what you were saying earlier about the work in CPS and what you were seeing with those working there having the dark humor, or as you said, the flat affect. And of course, there's the other ways that it might show up with issues such as substance usage or other relational points. And you mentioned that you work with first and second responders. I'm curious, just touching on that, where does that play into the standpoint of dealing with the echoes and the ripples as well, especially when we bring in historical trauma?
Yeah, I would say someone who has been working in they've been in some individuals even move from one first responder position to another. They're in military, then they get out the military, they're a police officer and maybe a correction officer too, right? And so there's this huge need to help. But and they're individuals who are really pulled together in that it's required to be able to hold it together in situations that others are falling apart, because you have to be able to even kind of take authority and manage a situation when in the most challenging of circumstances. So there are individuals that really hold things down very deep within their nervous system. So their intensity is going to be a lot less, right? So it's a little bit more challenging to tap in in a way. And I think it's really important for us not to label a nervous system where their sense of an issue when they're trying to process it is more subtle, because that's out of necessity, and that's, the issues often get kind of really contained, and also the person's got to be able to leave the stress and the constantly chaotic environment and go home, and change gears, right? And how does that dovetail with historical trauma? I would say, particularly maybe for those who are first and second responders, who are from historically, marginalized populations, right? That sense of wanting to act or react and having to contain it could be a parallel. That's just one thing that comes to mind in thinking of that. That historically they could have had ancestors that wanted to respond, but it wasn't safe to be able to respond. And so the first and second responders are able to respond to a certain level. They're able to respond to containing the situation, but they're not able to allow their full fight, flight, or freeze to move through, right? And so there is still something that gets contained. And so then they may be holding generational ripples of that in their system.
Right. Well, and even to the standpoint is the idea of both macro and micro that we've talked about larger macro cultural relations, slavery, genocide, spiritual removal, and so forth. But the micro versions of that can also have cultures inside families themselves that can be unsupportive and destructive, even if it doesn't show up on our larger cultural stage. So when we look at that historical aspect, when we look at that connection of spirit and the ancestors, we're also looking just as much as what is the culture of this family.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to taking your Echoes and Ripples training next month. And with that, I'm wondering is where can other people find out for when you're doing your next one later in the year and into next year? And where can people find to contact you?
Yeah, so the best place to check is indigenacounseling.com. And the way that I got that name, it's very interesting. I was trying to think of what to name my practice, and all of a sudden, just out of the blue, Indigena came to me. And I'm like, well, that sounds like indigenous. Let me look it up. And I Googled it, and I saw that Indigena is or the Latin version of indigenous. It means indigenous, and indigenous mean the same thing. I'm like, well, that's it.
So
and my sister-in-law is like, oh, I don't really like that name. I'm like, well, that name came to me, so that's that I like it, and this is going to be the name of what I do. So it's Indigena with an A, counseling.com.
All right, so I'll try to have that in the show notes. And I would say the ancestors were talking to you then. Somebody was talking to you then.
I would agree. Yeah, and then it's my name is Regina, and it's got Gina at the end of Indigena too, which didn't fail to because I was named for my ancestor. Actually, her name was Mary Jean Ronquillo, my mom's grandmother. And so, yeah, it's just all very interesting how it all comes together.
Very nice. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this episode, and look forward to seeing us at the next couple of events here that you'll be teaching, and we'll also be both at with Steve's. And I hope that there are others out there who are looking forward to also taking your class as well with Brainspotting. So,
thank you, Perry.
You're welcome. So with that, folks, that's our episode for today. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you check out our programs. here on the Voice America Network. This is Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be safe. See you soon.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.